Going live. Okie dokie. Here we go. Ah, come on. Ugh. Okay. I'm hoping that the sound is okay, and here we are again, folks. I think Adnan will be rescheduling his interview with Radhika Desai, which will be interesting, regardless. Eventually, when it comes on, um, I'm going to do even more Grundrisse for a while today. This is the 18th of August. Recalling, of course, that the last time I was with you for Weekly Marks yesterday was looking at the manuscript of 1857 to 1858, the Grundrisse. I began the idea with an introduction, and so we will continue on working through this is the Ed George notes to the annotation, essentially his notes for reading notes for the part 3, the introduction to the Grundrisse. And essentially he spent his time doing a very basic informal logic syllogism that is about Socrates being mortal and a human, blah blah blah. But the point of doing that, of course, is to show that Hegel's logic is no different than Aristotle's logic, which is really important, for understanding how we would read Hegel's influence on Marx. So um, so returning to Marx, effectively paraphrasing. Let's see, did I get farther than this? I can't remember. I guess can't remember what I did yesterday. Unmediatedly, determinio negatio. Uh, Marx, no, the second unity, blah, blah, blah. Okay, well, I'll go back to where I was yesterday. I will try anyway. Because we're still back to talking about coats. I mean, eventually it's all about linen and coats, even though we might not want it to be such. So let us return now to Marx. I won't rehearse all that stuff with the syllogisms and stuff, but it is actually shows that there's continuity between what is sort of normal academic logic and looking at Marx. It's not that The argument in English is not that dissimilar. And to use what is sort of basic undergraduate stuff on logic applies still to Marx. It's not anything new or alien. It is, in fact, it is the continuity of sort of approaching a 19th century text. Let us return to Marx. Effectively paraphrasing James Mill, Marx has identified in his analysis production as a starting point in a process that ends in consumption, Department 1 and Department 2, with these two endpoints being mediated, i.e. separated and brought together by distribution and exchange. This looks like a syllogism, he says. Production, the generality determined by general laws of nature, is conjoined to consumption. Production, generality, consumption, carried out by individuals. The singularity through the intermediation of distribution and exchange. There is some truth to this picture, admits Marx, but its representation is a superficial one. You can spend a whole thing on just the issue of how superficial that is. So in brackets, why are there two intermediating categories here? That is distribution and exchange. The middle and the syllogistic figure he has identified, Marx notes, which consists of distribution and exchange, has a dual aspect, since distribution is determined as actuated by society, that's distribution in society, and exchange as actuated by individuals. So what you see between distribution and exchange is literally the difference between agency and structure. That is, you have a social structure and then you have individual agency. This is very simple social science problems and nothing mystical or, political in that sense. Now, what Marx means here by distribution is the allocation of the social product according to social class. Under a regime of capitalist production relations, the social product is distributed in the form of wages, surplus value, and rent. And then there's a further distribution of surplus value in the forms of profit and interest. So all of those things are kind of there. And they're still there. They're there now as I speak. Only after this distribution has taken place does market exchange, in which distributed social value is converted in commodities. This is the Marxian take on this, occur. Now, this stance counterposed to present-day mainstream bourgeois economic theory, which holds that the distribution of the social product only takes place in the market according to the laws of supply and demand. In reality, of course, what is distributed in market exchange is not the total social product, but a part of the social product which has already been allocated. So this is the point that the Frankfurt School is looking at, that there's a market and objects get moved around and whatever, but consciousness is the real problem. And the Frankfurt School is kind of going, oh, okay, well, there's all these objects and stuff, and you get war and other kinds of craziness, but it's the awareness that has a kind of relation. This is why I was listening to, and you might take a look at, what the critical theory working group is looking at in terms of the theory of rackets, as in racketeering, which is sort of really interesting stuff, not yet fully explicated, I would say. Anyway, back to Ed George's notes. This view, the identification of these categories and their relation, Marx takes as representative of the political economists, the classics. Without elaborating his own view, Marx notes that the opponents of this interpretation, whether within or without the latter's, that is the political economist domain, fail in their critique, either by not differentiating correctly these categories, which we're just talking about, or by treating them as independent and unconnected, or as not dependent. This is an interesting problem. Just the independent and connected also raises its own issues, like relative autonomy and blah, blah, blah. Marx will now take a closer look at what is involved. Section 1, production and consumption. To start, Marx takes the relation between production and consumption. In the first place, he notes they are the same thing directly. They're just different sides of the thing. Unmittelbar is Marx's word in the original. mediatedly, i.e., they're the same thing in the one act. We can say that that's, you can sort of appreciate that, right? Firstly, because the individual who develops his capacities while producing expends them as well, using them up in the act of production. So when you act, you've given something, or you've, sort of exercised something, executed something, as it were. Secondly, because means of production are used and expended and broken down into the basic elements and raw material, so it's machinery and raw material, which does not retain its natural form and condition, is also consumed. It's transformed, right? So the act of production itself is thus, in all its moments, also an act of consumption. And Marx quotes Spinoza, which I think that this connection is really important and not covered by a lot of people, though Slavoj Žižek does that. Determinatio est negatio. That is, Marx notes that the political economists, with their concept of productive consumption, are already familiar with this identity between consumption and production within or in production. The machinery uses stuff and raw materials get consumed, and a person doing the production, working on the line, is, expending something, right? But he suggests that the effect of this understanding is to separate off the consumption that production necessarily entails from consumption proper. This latter thing is considered by the political economists as the destructive antithesis of production. So you have thesis, antithesis, right? So there is the thing, right, production, but there is an antithesis to production. So, but notes Marx, this type of consumption is also production. That is, if you consume something, you're also producing something. And let me give you, before we start going further on, let me suggest to you that, for example, if you go to a movie theater, you're not simply passively consuming something, you're taking an active interest in engaging with the text that's up on the movie screen, right? So there is a kind of production going on, and that can obviously be confusing to you, but the audience does produce, They consume on the one hand, but they're not passive receivers. They are performing an act of production, that is interpretation, understanding, meaning, messages, they're produced. So anyway, back to the text. It is obvious that man produces his own body, for example, through nutrition, a form of consumption. But the same applies to any other kind of consumption, which in one way or another produces man in some aspect, or reproduces man, you see, right? You can see where that's going. This type of consumption Marx calls consumptive production, as opposed to its reverse, right? Consumptive production. You could say that you're sitting in an audience and watching TV or whatever is a form of consumptive production. And he charges political economy with illegitimately positing this type of consumption as a different kind of consumption. Now, the point is, of course, as information scholars might attend to this issue, is it really different? So, because in order to operate a machine without getting your hand caught and watching a movie, pretty much, you're trying to do it carefully without, throwing up your popcorn or whatever, barfing, whatever. For Marx, the direct unity in which production coincides with consumption and consumption coincides with production allows their direct duality to persist. I know that sounds complicated on the one hand, but there is this kind of interchange, that's going on. And it has a certain kind of both directness and indirectness. And one, of course, is, more, quote unquote, more productive than the other, unless you're a member of the Nielsen rating people, obviously. But that's another story. Despite this identity, or perhaps identities, plural, Marx still insists that there's a mediating movement between production and consumption. For each provides the reason for the other to exist. They're dependent in that sense, or interdependent. Production mediates consumption, for which it provides the material. Consumption without production would have no object. There's no popcorn, no movie on the screen, blah, blah, blah. But consumption also mediates production by providing for the products the subject for whom they are products. So you can see, just to use, media industries as an example, there's a whole apparatus that does production, but they have this interrelation with the audience, with, you need actors and blah, blah, blah. You need all those kinds of things. There's lots of things going on. Marx now explores the claim that consumption creates production. It does so in two ways, he says. First, in that only through consumption does a product become a real product. See, we're still engaged with this idea that production operates sort of away from reality or reproduction. So that's an issue. In that only through consumption does a product become a real product. Only consumption that by dissolving the product gives it the finishing stroke. For production is a product not merely as objectified activity, but only as an object for the active subject. In other words, 20 yards of linen, and if the suit's properly tailored, you're probably pretty much the only person who can fit the suit relative to, tailoring, let's put it that way. Second, consumption creates the need for new production, right? Somebody sees it, I want a suit like that, or whatever. There is no production without need, and it is consumption that continuously replenishes that need. So, you may not think a market is going on, but if you see someone in a new suit, and even though you may be the only person to see that person in the suit, and you want a version of that suit, you're going to go up and say, where did you get that suit? Did you buy that suit somewhere? Did you have it made? Blah, blah, blah. This second unity, that formed by the fact that consumption creates production, and the point of this is that it's a path and a circuit, and that's what Marx is trying to convince you, that it is not a single moment, but a multiplicity of moments, is belied by three further determinations which, in addition, indicate the primacy of production over consumption. And so this is a form follows function idea. Something comes first, but it's not an absolute first, right? It is something derived from some metabolism, right? It doesn't sit idly by, and God doesn't bring it down as in a miracle. It's just a moment that we use to decide the primacy of production over consumption. First, production supplies consumption with its object. Consumption without an object is no consumption. That's pretty obvious, right? Second, in addition to supplying consumption with its object, it also gives it its form. That is, it gives it its finish, right? As Marx puts it, it provides the mode of consumption. Hunger is hunger, but hunger that is satisfied by cooked meat eaten with knife and fork differs from hunger that devours raw meat with the help of hands, nails, and teeth. Third, production, in addition to providing the object to fulfill the need, also creates the need that requires the object. So you see different moments in this process. The primacy of production over consumption is expressed here in the way that the former plays a determining role in the social level. That is the level of culture, as it were, within which the latter occurs. So because it implies that there was some necessity that precedes this, a premise, right? This occurs in context. This is the metabolism issue. When consumption emerges from its original natural crudeness and immediacy, and its remaining in that state would be due to the fact that production was still caught in natural crudeness. Now you can sushi bars, right? Then it is itself as an urge mediated by the object. The felt need for the object is created by the perception of the object. Production therefore produces not only an object for the subject, but also a subject for the object. And the completeness, of your visit to a sushi bar is not necessarily raw food. It often, it is only a place in the complete meal, because you do get often, or if you request it or whatever, more prepared or more cooked food. And even in fact, sushi or, as opposed to sashimi, has a cooked component, or can have a cooked component. Hence, it is the case both that the production produces consumption, in that it produces what is consumed, how it is consumed, and the persons who consume it, and that consumption produces production, insofar as it produces in the producer the inclination to fulfill the needs posed by consumption. You really wanted to eat that fugu, right? Anyway, the unity formed by production and consumption is thus threefold. There is first an unmediated unity, i.e., the one is the other in the same act, even if the political economists still distinguish between consumptive production, i.e., reproduction, and productive consumption. This is a very small reversal, but I think you want to look syntactically at what that means. Anyway, then there is how each stands as the mediation of the other, because all this is about mediation. That is, you have a medium, that is the material itself. You have media, which is a plurality, which describes the transmission or reception of this. And then you have, both sides, production, consumption, and whatever. So back to the text. Production creates the material as the external object for consumption. Consumption creates the need as the internal object. So it's internal versus external. And the internal object is the purpose, the reason for doing production. Finally, this is the third step. This is the third moment. Each creates the other as its other. It is consumption that turns the result of production into a product, and she who produces into a producer, right? And lest you think that that's unimportant, even in current day media, there's sort of a unfortunate inflation in who gets a producer credit, for example, or who gets to join the Producers Guild of America, just in terms of that kind of credit. Now, one might think, therefore, that nothing would be simpler than to declare production and consumption identical. It's perfectly symmetric. Well, it's not. It's asymmetric. This is a view that Marx imputes to what is called socialist belletristes, and also to the French political economist Jean-Baptiste Say. To anticipate a little, it's worth looking at who Marx is referring to here and what he might have found objectionable in their positions. Now, according to the editors of the collected works of Marx, among the socialist belletristes, Marx refers to are vulgar socialists, like the German true socialists, in particular, Karl Grun. Grun, 1817 to 1887, was a German socialist, former young Hegelian, contemporary of Marx in his university days, and target of Marx and Engels' sarcasm in the text, The German Ideology. Towards the end of the critique in The German Ideology of Grun's own critique of French socialism, Marx and Engels admonish him for this remark, where production and consumption can be separated temporally and spatially, in theory and in external reality, but in essence, they are one. Is not the communist, not communist, but communist occupation, i.e. the baking of bread, a productive activity, which is in its turn consumption for 100 others. Well, if you believe in loaves and fishes, whatever. Among other arguments against Grun, Marx and Engels point out that in positing the unity of production and consumption in this way, Grun omits to mention that the consumption of a product manifests itself through the demand for it. And this is what Mosley hits Heinrich with, this demand question, which is a very major topic in the entire discussion of, a bunch of things in Marxist political economy. Through the demand for it, and the demand, this is the second part of it, of course, and demand expressed in money. Okay, so note that an additional thing of extraction has occurred, and you begin to think about, you don't think about the product itself, but rather you think about its equivalence, whatever that means, in money or commodity money, blah, blah, blah. The economists, too, refer to the inseparability of consumption and production and to the absolute identity of supply and demand, especially when they wish to prove that overproduction never takes place. And this is a topic that will return, as they say, 65, footnote 65. Now, why Marx wishes to argue in the introduction that the identity between production and consumption cannot be reduced to a simple one now becomes clearer. If it really were the case that production and consumption were no more than the same act conceived of from just merely from different standpoints, then of course there could be no crisis. It was just, just a minor difference. What was produced would be consumed automatically, used up completely. This is like market clearing. By definitions, as it were. This is the relevance of the reference to J.B. Say, who is, of course, best known now, and probably best known in Marx's day, too, for the contention widely interpreted as implying that the supply of a product automatically and necessarily creates the demand for it, the notion known as Say's law. And you see this in every beginning, economics textbook. This little, reference, whether footnoted or whatever. A proposition that rules out the possibility of crises. This is a fundamental, kind of idea that, well, demand and supply, if you think of them as curves as opposed to math, their intersection must be, market price. Well, the reality is, of course, in a static model, you could say that, but reality is not static in that sense. So in his 1803 Traité d'économie politique, Say had argued that the terms to consume, to destroy the utility, to annihilate the value of anything are as strictly synonymous as the opposite terms to produce, to communicate utility, to create value, and convey to the mind precisely the same idea. Now, that all makes sense if you're just drawing a cross figure between supply and demand and you get a price. But the reality is quite different, and that's what Marx is trying to get to. No, says Marx, consumption and production are not two ways of perceiving the same act, but two moments of a single process in which the latter is the point of departure and dominant moment. That is, production is the point of departure and dominant moment. If society is analyzed as if it were a single subject, as Say does, J.B. Say does, then it is production which predominates. The individual produces an object and through its consumption returns to himself. But he returns as a productive and self-reproducing individual. Consumption thus appears as a moment of production. Now, but this is even more the case when society is viewed as a society. Now, the consumption of the product is extrinsic to the producer, i.e., is consumed not by the producer, but by somebody else. Between production and consumption now appears, and this is the intermediate terms, right, distribution. So this is a way of trying to talk about that thing that's between production and consumption. So number two, finally we're on point two, which you want to think about Marx writing the Grundrisse, and he's going, okay, this is kind of how I think it looks like. And then now let's talk about what's in between. Marx notes that in the works of political economy, categories seem to appear twice, once under the heading of production and once under that of distribution. The list of land, labor, and capital as agents of production seems to match that of rent, wages, and profit. That is, rent for land, wages for labor, and profit for capital, along with interest, as determined and determining forms of distribution, i.e. sources of income. But if we look closer, we can see that, quote, the structure of distribution is entirely determined by the structure of production. Profit and interest presuppose capital. Wages presuppose wage labor, not labor in general, but, more specific labor. And then thirdly, rent presupposes landed property and not land in general. So there's a difference between, predetermined, royalty or rich folks own land, landed property, and not just simply, natural terrestrial space. So, quote, distribution itself is then a product of production, not only with regard to the object that only the result of production can be distributed, but also with regard to the form. Remember, form has a special meaning here, right? that the particular mode of participation in production determines the specific forms of distribution, the form or structure in which one shares in distribution. Close quote. Footnote 73. The categories of distribution are specific to the society, i.e., to the set of social forms in which they appear. It is thus, quote, altogether an illusion to posit land in production and rent in distribution, etc. It's an abstraction, right? Footnote 74. What is posited in production alongside rent is property in land. So you see all these different connections that, we generally assume in some way. Somebody always owns stuff like that. And I'm breaking now for the moment, but to remind you that, no land is not owned or has certain kind of rights, or, some people make a claim to something. So all that wilderness out there, wherever wilderness might be, it's not really wilderness. Somebody probably has a claim to it. All that tundra out there is Russian tundra, Norwegian tundra, etc. Ricardo, who is criticized in the field of political economy for only considering production, this is the Marxist critique, in fact, treats the analysis of distribution as the principal task of political economy. He does this because of having instinctively treated the forms of distribution as the most definite expression in which the agents of production are found in a given society. Now, there's a basis for this. For an individual producer, it is distribution that appears paramount. What are you producing for? Distribution appears as the social law that determines her position within the system of production. Even on the social scale, it appears that it is the modes of distribution that determine and regulate production. Quote, a conquering people divides the land among the conquerors and in this way imposes a definite mode of distribution and form of landed property, thus determining production. Or it turns the conquered into slaves, thus making slave labor the basis of production. You can see where this is going, right? Or a people breaks up the large landed estates into plots in a revolution, hence gives production a new character by this new distribution. Or legislation perpetuates land ownership in certain families, the royalty, or allocates labor as a hereditary privilege. This is feudalism, right? Thus fixing it according to caste. In all of these cases, and they are all historical, distribution does not seem to be regulated and determined by production, but on the contrary, production seems to be regulated and determined by distribution. So this is that, interchange, this interdependency of the two concepts of production and distribution, close quote. But before distribution takes the form of the distribution of products, at first it takes on the form, on the one hand, of the distribution of the means of production of products, and on the other, of the distribution of the people within the structure of the production of the products, the subsuming of individuals under definite relations of production. In other words, some people, own the means of production, and other people are owned by the means of production, whatever. The distribution of products is subsequent to and a consequence of this double prior distribution of instruments of production and the distribution of people. Now, what is more, this latter distribution, that is, of instruments of production and of people, is not only a precondition for the distribution of products, which is automatically given by that distribution, but is also itself a moment of production. And because of this, analysis of production separate from it would be an idle abstraction. The core of the political economist, then, is to take production as historically immutable. This leads them to self-restrict themselves to the analysis of distribution by treating production as an external truth, like a cornucopia or the Garden of Eden or something, they confine history to the domain of distribution. Quote, the analysis of distribution as a moment of production obviously belongs to the analysis of production itself, in which, insofar as production must proceed from a given distribution of instruments of production, the distribution of these is antecedent to production. But the distribution of instruments of production is itself dependent on the form of production, that is, the employment of machinery, altered the distribution of both the instruments of production and the products. Modern large-scale landed property itself is the result not only of modern trade and modern industry, but also of the application of the latter to agriculture. See, there's an attempt to make this all kind of complete. Now, close quote, the question of the role of distribution in production boils down to that of the role that historical conditions generally play in production and how production is related to the process of history in general. And in this turn clearly belongs to the analysis and discussion of production itself. Marx pursues the matter no further. Now, he does this because, of course, he's going to try and yak about it some other time or place, but, whatever. Remember, the Grundrisse is a foundational text in that context. Number 3, exchange. See, I'm only halfway through what I was going to yammer about, so we may talk for another 15 minutes or so and then stop because of the other thing that happened before. All right, section number 3, exchange. Circulation is either no more than a moment of exchange, Marx notes, or it is simply a synonym for it. He thus pays the term no more attention. Now, the point, of course, is that circulation will return in a big deal way in volume 2, but anyway, of Capital. Exchange, now, so back to the text. Section 3, exchange. Exchange mediates production and distribution. The latter, that is distribution, determined by production on the one hand, and consumption on the other. Since consumption, as we have established, is a moment of production, exchange is a moment of production too. Within production, the exchange of activities and capacities which takes place in production itself is a direct and essential part of production. The same is also true for the exchange of products, where this exchange is only part of the means of the production of articles of unproductive consumption. Then there is what Marx calls the exchange between dealers and dealers, presumably referring to exchange between industrial capitalists and merchant capitalists and among merchant capitalists themselves. So there's this intermediary capitalist form, right, that will come back to be discussed. Industrial capitalists, merchant capitalists, financial capitalists, so they're there. This too is entirely determined by production, as is itself a productive activity, which of course can confuse you when we get to financialization. Only insofar as exchange involves the exchange of products for the individual consumer does it appear as something external to production. But even here, number 1, there can be no exchange without a division of labor in production. Number 2, exchange involving private individuals presupposes private production. And number 3, the intensity, extent, and nature of exchange are determined by the development and structure of production, and that such that exchange in all its moments appears either to be directly comprised in production or else determined by it. In conclusion, this analysis of the categories of production, consumption, distribution, and exchange has shown the following. Number 1, the categories neither exist separately from one another, nor are they identical. Rather, they stand as individual elements of a single totality. This is the same totality that David Harvey is talking about when he talks about the Grundrisse. Within this totality, production is the dominant moment, both with regard to itself as with the other elements. Number 3, distribution, insofar as it involves the agents of production, is a moment of production itself. And number 4, a given form of production both defines the forms of consumption, distribution, and exchange and the relations of the different moments among themselves. And 5, production is, however, although the dominant moment, also determined by the other moments of the totality of which it forms a part. There is, as with any organic unity, an interaction between all these different moments. Section 3, subsection 1, the method of political economy. We're still in on the notes by Ed George of section 3, or chapter 3 of the Grundrisse. Analysis and synthesis, semicolon, inquiry and presentation. So, with what should a political economic analysis begin? Often a very trenchant question. It would seem to have to begin with the real and the concrete. Thus, it would seem natural to start with the category of population, the demographics, which forms the basis and the subject of the whole social act of production. But this would be a mistake. If no account is taken of the classes of which the population is composed, then population as such would be an abstraction. It's too general in that sense, because it's pretty clear that hierarchies arise in no other form except perhaps primitive communism. Do you have, sort of something that exists before classes? Hierarchies do exist. But then the notion of classes too would be an abstraction, unless account would be taken of the elements, i.e. social relations on which they are based, that is, wage, labor, capital, etc. For these social relations presuppose the economic facts of, for example, exchange, division of labor, prices, etc. Now, population, therefore, unspecified, is an abstraction, another of the many abstractions that we've had that sort of, wade through. So if one were to start one's analysis with population, it would be a chaotic conception of the whole. It is in this sense that Marx calls population an abstraction. Now, why is it an abstraction? And yes, there's a Darwinian question somehow lurking behind, but because it is a conceived of without reference to or abstracted from the multiple determinations of which it is composed. Now, why would such a conception be chaotic? Because what is being conceived is a complex of multiple determinations, but what these are and how they collectively give rise to the totality are ignored. Now, the totality, that is the whole, in the sentence quoted at the start of this paragraph, which is the result of this complex of determinations, would stand in thought without having been, so to speak, untangled. So it's still tangled, right? In thought, because what is chaotic here is not the object under analysis, but precisely the conception of it, which is the whole business of this set of abstractions. That is, it's not the thing itself, but more what we think about the thing itself. That is why the analysis is no more than a conception, Vorstellung. Population as it exists in the world is not chaotic, but obviously complex. You can work through it. It's not purely, random violence is not yet completely there. People kind of order themselves, whether it's by the family or by groupings or whatever. A representation of population in thought without taking account of its complexity is chaotic because it takes no account of its complexity. And often, yes, when people generalize, like certain politicians assume that, all people of a certain color or class or endowment or whatever are generalizable, and that's just wrong. How then should one proceed? By taking the complex object and then examining through closer definition to arrive analytically at increasingly simple concepts. And I think you want to say simplified concepts, to follow a movement from the complex to the simple along the lines of that suggested by Marx earlier, from, for example, population, to the classes of which it is composed, to the social relations on which those classes rest, and so on. Now, in this way, Marx says, by moving to increasingly thinner abstractions, one passes from the imagined concrete to arrive at the simplest determinations. So let's look at this sentence in more detail. First, imagined concrete in the original text is vorstellen, vorstellen, concreten, vorstellen is derived from the verb vorstellen, which is where Vorstellung comes from. Vorstellen is conceived in the same sense as Vorstellung is conception. The concrete here is concrete because of its real complexity. Hence, if here it is conceived as a Vorstellung, then what Marx labels the imagined concrete is synonymous with the chaotic conceptions of earlier. That's probably too subtle for all of us. Finally, if one follows this procedure, applying increasingly thinner abstractions, one arrives at the simplest determinations possible, i.e., one arrives at a point beyond which one cannot simplify further, as though there were a limit. To continue my analogy, at this point, the object which one is trying to conceptualize is now fully untangled. The determinations stand exposed. But as a consequence of this analytic process, their unity has been undone. So the more you try and simplify it, the more it gets, more complicated, perhaps. Now begins the opposite work of synthesis. So essentially what he's looked at is the first element of sort of antithetical, juxtaposition. So now begins the opposite work of synthesis. The object under consideration now needs to be assembled in thought from the determinations already identified. But now, the object will not be a chaotic conception, but will be comprehended in function of its actual or real complexity. So that's the distinction he made in the upper paragraphs. He's trying to distinguish it, however subtly, in talking about population as an example, the differences. From there, the endpoint of the analysis, Marx tells us, it would be necessary to make a return journey until one arrived once more at population, which this time, so you're going to arrive at it several times, which this time would not be a chaotic conception of a whole, but a rich totality of many determinations and relations. Remember, this is the same totality that David Harvey talks about. The task, then, which consists of two cognitive stages, that is, an analytical decomposition, which is what was performed above, and a synthetic reconstruction, see, this is the dialectic at work, is to identify in thought the real, quote, rich totality of many, many determinations and many relations, unquote. Then, and only then, can one begin to talk meaningfully about the object in question. This procedure, of course, exactly summarizes what Marx did in the previous section, as I just said. He listed the set of determinations it's already identified by political economy of production, distribution, exchange, and consumption. A syllogistic figure, but a superficial one, a Vorstellung, a chaotic conception. He then identified the set of mediations that operated between production and consumption and established that the two form a unity, but the unity of production and consumption, but the unity is founded on mediating movements in which production is primary. He then distinguished distribution as a further moment of production, a moment which plays a determining role in it, but which is ultimately determined by production itself. Now, the point, as he'll come to in subsequent volumes, is that it's a circuit, comes back around. Then he examined the mediating role of exchange in the emerging conceptual totality, and he discovered that it, in all of its movement, is either subsumed, subsumed under production, or determined by it. He finally arrived at an understanding of production as a complex, multiply determined totality. How easy that was. Composed of moments and the interactions between them. In short, no longer a chaotic superficiality, but now a rich totality of many determinations and relations. Now, it seems a little delusional, I suppose, but this is a kind of important procedure, a kind of, as it were, a deconstructing, not, ability and then a reconstruction that is important to further along the argument. Now, back to the text. It's perhaps useful to compare what Marx writes here in 1857 to what he would go on to write, commenting on his method. In the afterword to the second edition of Capital, Volume 1 in 1873, quote, the method of presentation must differ in form from that of inquiry. He would say, the latter has to appropriate the material in detail to analyze its different forms of development and to track down their inner connection. This is the stage of analysis, the work described in the introduction as the examination through closer definition to arrive analytically at increasingly simple concepts by moving to increasingly thinner abstractions and passing, this all, rehearses what happened above, and passing from the imagined concrete to arrive at the simplest determinations. Now, only after this work has been done can the real movement be appropriately presented, he went on. If this is done successfully, if the life of the subject matter is now reflected back into the ideas, then it may appear as if we have before us an a priori construction. Now, this is evidently the analog of the work of synthesis. Okay, so it has a logical consistency in that context. Thus, the distinction Marx makes in 1873 between the analytical stage of inquiry, the Darstellung, and the subsequent one of presentation, the Forschung, exactly parallels that of the separation of the stages of analysis and synthesis he makes in 1857. So let me break here, and this is that kind of moment of connecting between the earlier Marx and the later Marx, and there's, you can argue for some sort of epistemological break, but maybe not if you want to accept this kind of logic. So let us return to the introduction. The 17th century economist, Marx says, maybe Petty and Bois-Guilbert is who he has in mind, followed the analytic approach described above, the first course, as they always started with the living whole, the population, the nation, the state, several states, etc. But analysis always led them in the end to the discovery of a few determining abstract general relations such as division of labor, money, value, etc. From here, as soon as these individual moments were more or less clearly deduced and abstracted, economic systems were evolved from the simple, such as labor, division of labor, need, exchange value, advanced to the state, international exchange, and the world market. This work of synthesis, that is the latter, of reconstructing in thought the complex social reality under consideration, building the single complex out of the multiple simple, is obviously the correct scientific method. See, there is a methodology here, and it's truly not anything new or earth-shattering, but it is orderly, and I would assert that it is. And often there's too much emphasis on the question of crisis when, in fact, the logic sort of is there. The concrete is concrete because it is a synthesis of many determinations, thus a unity of the diverse, says Marx. But the concrete here that he refers to is the concrete in thought. The real complex object successfully reproduced in the intellect. The contrast here is with the chaotic conception. So there's chaotic conceptions, but if you have a right mind, as they say, you can get to the concrete in thought, Marx says. But the concrete in thought is not given. It has to be constructed or synthesized in thinking, Marx says. It, i.e. the concrete, appears as a process of summing up, as a result, not as the starting point, even if the real object here represented is the real starting point, because it is, in addition to being what is captured in thought is concrete, if it is so captured, is also the starting point of perception, the Anschauung, and the conception, the Vorstellung. There's a difference between the two, right? what you see with your eyes and what you cognize or think about, right? And that difference still, actually has some continuity relative to physiology. It is from the real object and the thinking subject's engagement with it that thought comes. Marx summarizes what he has identified. The first step, that is the step of analysis, dissipates the full conception, the Vorstellung, into abstract determinations. The second step, that of synthesis, leads from these abstract determinations to the reproduction of the concrete by the way of thinking. You see this dialectical path. From abstract determinations to the reproduction of the concrete by the way of thinking. Number two, subsection 2, the dialectical method. Marx now contrasts what he said with the parallel process described by Hegel. The fundamental difference for him is that for Hegel, the real is the product of thinking. Hegel arrived at the illusion that the real was the result of thinking synthesizing itself within itself, delving ever deeper into itself, and moving by its inner motivation. Now, for Marx, on the other hand, this method of advancing from the abstract to the concrete is simply the way in which thinking assimilates the concrete and reproduces it as a mental concrete. Thinking does not produce the real, could be delusional in that sense. It reproduces it in thought. So it understands as a matter of reflection that it is a reproduction and not the thing itself, right? One hopes that that's the case. Now, madness, of course, has other goals. In the 1873 afterward, Marx contrasted his method and that of Hegel like this, quote, "My dialectical method is, in its foundation, not only different from the Hegelian, but exactly opposite to it. For Hegel, the process of thinking, which he even transforms into an independent subject under the name of the idea, is the creator of the real world, and the real world is only the external appearance of that idea, of the idea. Now, with me, that is with Marx, the reverse is true. The ideal is nothing but the material world reflected in the mind of man and translated into forms of thought." See, this is that putting Hegel on its head thing, right? This is the inversion that we see, not unlike a camera obscura, et cetera, et cetera. So this is where the inversion occurs, and lots of ink has been spilled on this. This is still Marx in the 1873 forward. I criticize the mystificatory side of the Hegelian dialectic nearly 30 years ago, right, in the 40s, at a time when it was still the fashion. This is the economic and philosophical manuscripts of the 40s, right? The mystification which the dialectic suffers in Hegel's hands is by no means prevents him from being the first to present its general forms of motion in a comprehensive and conscious manner. With him, it is standing on its head. It must be inverted in order to discover the rational kernel within the mystical shell. And that relation, close quote, you can see that this is a very vital little paragraph and kind of important, particularly in the 1873 afterward, because this is, this is going on a ways and only 10 years before Marx passes away. Again, the consonance between his account in 1873 and that of the introduction is clear. Marx, in 1857, warns us, however, not to conflate the manner by which the real concrete is constructed in thought and how the real concrete originates in the world. So you're trying not to conflate the way you construct things in your head and the way it actually is in the world. So take the simplest economic category, says Marx, exchange value, for example. That's not simplest. In the realm of the real, exchange value, the price of a commodity in terms of another commodity, presupposes population, a population which produces under definite conditions as well as a distinct type of family or community or state, etc. i.e., it is an abstract, one-sided relation of an already existing concrete living whole, that is the population. As a concept, however, as a mental abstraction, its existence is antediluvian, i.e., pre-existing of a social totality of which it forms a part. To an idealist consciousness, and that Marx would call it a philosophical consciousness, the real person, that is the active subject, is reduced to the comprehending mind, and the real world to the comprehended world, i.e., to the comprehending mind's own consciousness of it. So you can already see that a certain abstraction is taking place. Here, in this worldview, the real act of production is the movement of categories. The real concrete is reduced to the conceived concrete, and the real totality reduced to the conceived totality. So you could say that there's an idealist problem set forth here, and what Marx is trying to say is, well, this process may occur, but it's however, it is a material process. That is, blood is circulating, and the mind, however it's constructed, is engaging in a material process. This goes all the way back to the pre-Socratics. Marx's argument here is directed at the idealism, if not the dialectic of Hegel, but it is not only directed at Hegel. Such a worldview in which concepts are given priority over what they are concepts of does not require a Hegelian metaphysics. This is where it separates. It only requires the assimilation and transformation of perceptions, that is, the Anschauung and images, Vorstellung, into concepts, i.e., the taking of appearances partial and one-sided without having been subject to the kind of analysis described earlier as good coin, chaotic conception, instead of real, rich totality of many determinations and relations. And we'll come back to this issue of perceptions and concepts. It's not a necessarily a difficult one, but I think it's the assimilation and transformation of perceptions and images into concepts. Nevertheless, it remains the case that what is captured in thought and what exists outside it, however the former, what's in your head, be acquired, are different. What Marx calls the totality as a conceptual totality is the product of thought, what your mind does, the product of the thinking mind, which assimilates the world in the only way open to it. The real subject remains outside the mind and independent of it. Now, this is an important distinction, and there's, a century of ink behind this. The subject, that is society, must always be envisaged as the premise of conception, even when the theoretical method is employed. In other words, the rejection of an idealist worldview, whether sanctified theoretically as in Hegel or existing de facto, does not gainsay the necessity of the theoretical appropriation of reality. It simply means that the theoretical appropriation that your brain does undertake and be grounded on the separation of the object and its theoretical appropriation, and that theoretical appropriation proceed according to the kinds of procedures described above. So, I know that already sounds like double talk, but it is an order of separation. Way, and it is one way of talking about it. And with all due respect to analytic procedures, you can do that. You can even do it mathematically, but let's not go there yet. Number 3, the ordering of the category. But Marx, have not the simple categories also an independent historical and natural existence preceding that of the more concrete ones? Maybe, he says, Hegel, for example, correctly takes possession, the simplest legal relation of the subject, right? 9 points of the law, right? As the point of departure of the philosophy of law. The simple category, that is possession, predates historically the more concrete and more complex juridical conception of property. Putting your coat on a chair may be a claim, but it's not a perfect claim. And it's not juridical, certainly. Then there is the example of money. Money can exist and has existed in history before capital banks, wage labor, etc. came into being. Yep, we've talked about that before. Currency goes way back. In these two cases, it can be said that the simpler category can express relations predominating in a less developed whole, or subordinate relations in a more developed whole, relations which already existed historically before the whole had developed. The aspect expressed in a more concrete category. Sheikh talked about this in his comments on money and currency, if you recall. And needless to say, this is also brought up by Michael Hudson and a variety of other folks. And much like David Graeber talks about debt as, on the one hand, measured concretely, but on the other hand, is clearly an abstract category and made incredibly problematic. In both these cases, the order of historical development coincides with that of logical synthesis. So talking about Hudson or Sheikh or Graeber, there is logical synthesis going on. On the other hand, he notes the existence of societies with a sophisticated level of social development who do not use money or use it little. There are plenty of examples of that. There was no money in pre-Columbian, it's pre-Columbian Peru, he notes, even though there was cooperation and a highly developed division of labor. Slavonic communities mainly used money on their borders rather than internally, because you would make a currency exchange at borders. In antiquity, money only played a dominant role in trading nations, and that required, juridical-like relations. Even in the most advanced antiquity, among the Greeks and Romans, money reaches its full development, which is presupposed in modern bourgeois society only in the period of their disintegration. That's an interesting claim as well. All right. Hence, it's not necessarily the case that simpler, i.e., less concrete categories, predate more complex and more concrete social unities. It may be the case that the simpler category existed historically before the more concrete, even if its complete, intensive, and extensive development can nevertheless occur precisely in a complex form of society. But it may also be the case that the more concrete category be more fully evolved in a less developed form of society. Now, that's where, for example, things developed during the feudal period come back to be incredibly problematic if you believe in a techno-feudal society. But anyway, that's another story. Why the apparent indeterminacy? That is, the matter is complex for three things and their interrelations. So that would actually make six things enter into the matter, and the social reality of which a given category is an intellectual representation. The category itself and the social whole of which the particular social reality forms a single, simple, and abstract part. None of these elements is immutable. Take, for example, the category of labor. On the one hand, labor is, at least on the face of it, a very simple category. For the notion of labor in its universal form, as labor in general, is also as old as it. The notion that labor as such is the source of wealth is a notion that only emerges fully for the first time in the thought of Adam Smith. This is a breakthrough for Marx, both difficult and immense. Previously, it had been thought that it was that precious metals like gold and silver that represented wealth in pure form, the bullionist view, which is what Marx means when he refers to the monetary system, das monetary system, while the physiocrats had held that it was only agricultural labor that was the source of wealth. You can already see a division there. We're getting close to the end. On the one hand, then, the understanding of labor in general as the source of wealth is merely an abstract expression for the simplest and most ancient relation in which human beings act as producers, whatever the society they live in. On the other, it's quite something else. The abstraction of labor in general, that the presupposition that the specific form of a given labor is irrelevant to its nature as wealth-creating activity, is itself grounded in the actual nature of the society in which of the actually existing kinds of labor, none of which is seen in is any more the dominating one in which this abstraction is made. think of slaves. This abstraction of labor in general is not simply the conceptual result of a concrete totality of labors, but the real result of the actual abstraction of labor that occurs in a society in which the production of commodities predominates as a social form. Quote, this state of affairs is most pronounced in the most modern form of bourgeois society, the United States. It is only there that the abstract category labor, labor as such, labor sans phrase, the point of departure of modern economy, is first seen to be true in practice. The simplest abstraction, which plays the key role in modern economy and which expresses an ancient relation existing in all forms of society, appears to be true in practice in this abstract form only as a category of the most modern society, close quote. Here we see clearly the dialectic noted above, that between the social reality being conceptualized, the conceptualization itself, and the changing historical social milieu within which the conceptualization takes place. So you see the thing itself and its context, or its location. The example of labor strikingly demonstrates, quote, even for the most abstract categories, despite their being valid, precisely because they are abstractions for all epochs, etc., are in the determinateness of their abstraction just as much a product of historical conditions that retain their full validity only for and within these conditions. Now, Marx, unquote. Marx now draws the following conclusions from what he has been arguing. Now, there's a bit more, and I'm not going to get to that. Maybe I'll get to I think I can get to the end of it. Maybe that'll hopefully make this more complete. Okay. This comes to the key point and the end of the section in the Grundrisse, which is actually a vital point. The prior quotations are really good because they're the ones that do get repeated from the Grundrisse, requoted. Marx now draws the following conclusions from what he's been arguing. Bourgeois society is a result, and not a point of departure, did not fall from the sky, but is rather the product of a prior process of development. Now, this has consequences for how we understand it, and also for how we understand the societies that came before it. Thus, as the most developed and many-faceted historical organization of production, the categories which express bourgeois society's relations provide at the same time an insight into the structure and the relations of production of all previous forms of society, the ruins and components of which were used in its creation. Still see slavery. If there are indications of higher forms in the lower species of animals can only be understood when the higher forms themselves are already known. Bourgeois economy thus provides a key to that of antiquity, etc. This is not to say, as those political economists who see the categories of bourgeois society's transhistorical features of an immutable human nature do, that all societies are to some degree bourgeois. One can understand tribute, tithe, right? Tariffs, gifts, if one knows rent, but they must not be treated as identical. Marx wants to distance himself from the kind of teleological vision that would see bourgeois society as imminent to the historical process, the view that would see historical development as resting, in general, on the fact the latest form regards the earlier forms as stages leading toward itself. Now, this, uneven development is an important component of critique of this. Such a view is capable of a critical attitude towards prior stages of development, but is entirely incapable of self-criticism. But bourgeois society is a contradictory form of development, and as such contains relations of earlier forms of society, often only in very stunted shape, or as mere travesties. Thus, it is only superficially true that the categories of bourgeois economy are valid for all other forms of society, for they may contain within them a developed, stunted, caricatured form, always with substantial differences. The key to the criticism of prior development is criticism of the present. It was, quote, it was not until its self-criticism was to a certain extent prepared, as it were potentially, that the Christian religion was able to contribute to an objective understanding of earlier mythologies. Similarly, it was not until the self-criticism of bourgeois society had begun that bourgeois economy came to understand the feudal, ancient, and oriental economies. It's oriental despotism, ancient economy, slavery, etc. Insofar as bourgeois economy did not simply identify itself with the earlier economies in a mythological manner, although it does, its criticism of them, especially the feudal economy, you could argue that that's even happening today under quote-unquote techno-feudalism, against which it still had to wage a direct struggle, resembled the criticism that Christianity directed against heathenism, or which Protestantism directed against Catholicism. Still there. Welcome Christian nationalism. Marx now turns to what all this means for the method of presentation. Remember, presentation of the critique of the economic categories of bourgeois society, as is the case with all historical science or social science. The examination of the development of economic categories requires that they not be taken on their own terms. The object of study, that is modern bourgeois society, is given both in reality and in the mind. This means the existing categories themselves express forms of being, determinations of existence, and sometimes only individual aspects of this particular society, of the subject, that is the object, and that even from the scientific standpoint, it therefore by no means begins at the moment when it is first discussed as such. One needs to distinguish between the understanding given by the categories and the understanding of the categories. Now, this is important because it provides the decisive criteria for the arrangement of the material of study of political economy. So Marx gives an example, because this is a little abstract, needless to say. Nothing seems more natural than to begin with rent, with landed property, since it's bound up with the earth, the source of all production and all life, and with agriculture, the first form of production in more or less established societies. But this would be wrong. There is, says Marx, in every form of society, particular production, which determines the position and importance of all the others, and the relations obtaining in this branch accordingly determine those in all the other branches. In societies previous to bourgeois society, this was agriculture. In the case of pastoral peoples, the agricultural systems that sporadically emerge are based on communal property. In the case of settled agriculture, landed property predominates, and industry, for example, is completely dependent on it. Capital takes the form of landed property. But in bourgeois society, agriculture is reduced to a branch of industry, and as such, is completely dominated by capital. This is the distinction between bourgeois society and all societies which preceded. In all forms in which landed property rules supreme, the nature relationship still predominates. In the forms in which capital rules supreme, the social historically evolved element predominates. Now, this is the starting point in the analysis of bourgeois society. The starting point in the analysis of bourgeois society is capital, the economic power that dominates everything. Therefore, it is capital which must form both the point of departure and the conclusion, and must be analyzed before landed property. It would not be appropriate, therefore, to present the economic categories successively in the order in which they play the determining role in history. Their order of succession is determined rather by their mutual relation in modern bourgeois society. And this is quite the reverse of what appears to be their natural relation, or corresponds to the sequence of historical development. Now, the question is not, therefore, the place the economic relations took relative to each other in the succession of various forms of society in the course of history, but their position within modern bourgeois society. This is a point that is taken up later by Weber, for example. Marx concludes by elaborating the following plan for the presentation of his work. So this is, the outline, or this is why the Grundrisse has its importance. The arrangement has evidently to be made as follows. Number one, the general abstract determinations, and which therefore appertain more or less to all forms of society, but in the sense set forth above. Number two, the categories which constitute the internal structure of bourgeois society and on which the principal classes are based. So you have capital, wage labor, landed property. Their relation to one another, town and country, the three large social classes, exchange between them, among them, circulation, credit system, and of course, as private. Number three, the state as the epitome. Remember, this is how the kind of capital was divided in terms of sections and books, right? The state as the epitome of bourgeois society, analyzed in relation to itself, the unproductive classes, taxes, national debt, public credit, population, colonies, emigration. Number four, international character of production, international division of labor, international exchange, export and import, rate of exchange is all about trade, right? And number five, world market and crises. And this resembles, the big 6-volume plan for capital. And then number four, the production, the following. The last part of the introduction are a series of notes or subjects to be covered. See, it's not complete, and he's trying to work out what the thing is going to look like. And so the Grundrisse has this fragmentary element. Means of production and relations of production, relations of production and conditions of communication, forms of state and of consciousness in relation to the relations of production and of commerce. Marx lays out a numbered list of points which have to be mentioned here and should not be forgotten. It is not always clear what exactly he has in mind in each case. Ha! All right, so number one, he notes the influence of war on social and technological development. War develops certain economic conditions, i.e., e.g., wage labor, machinery, etc., earlier than within civil society. The relation between productive power and conditions of communication is likewise particularly evident in the army, which is why Sheikh talks about the army, why I talk about the army a lot, whatever. Number two, the relation of the hitherto existing idealistic historiography to realistic historiography. In particular, what is known as the history of civilization, which is all a history of religion and states. Number three, secondary and tertiary relations in general, derived and transmitted, non-original relations of production, the influence of international relations. Number four, reproaches about the materialism of this conception and its relation to naturalistic materialism, which is very problematic in the 19th century. Dialectic of the concepts, productive power, that is the means of production, and relation of production, a dialectic whose limits have to be defined and which does not abolish real difference. Number six, the unequal development of material production and, for example, art. In general, the concept of progress is not to be taken in the usual abstract form. With regard to art, etc., this disproportion is not so important and difficult to grasp as within practical social relations themselves. For example, in culture, relation of the United States to Europe. However, the really difficult point to be discussed here is how the relations of production as legal relations enter into uneven development. So this is that moment where you need to sort of think about, well, why are these so chaotic and disparate, or at least in appearance? For example, the relation of Roman civil law, this applies in smaller measure to criminal and public law to modern production. Number seven, this conception appears to be an inevitable development by vindication of chance, how, of freedom, etc. Influence of the means of communication, world history did not exist always, and history as world history as a result. Number eight, the starting point is, of course, determinateness by nature, subjectively and objectively, tribes, races, etc. Finally, in a well-known but enigmatic passage, Marx notes the disjunction between periods of artistic flowering and the general development of society, or therefore to the material basis, that is, the skeleton, as it were, of its organization. He notes that there are certain artistic forms. Marx cites the epic, right? The epic as a literary form, which can only appear in their classic form at an early stage of artistic development. With regard to Greek art, Greek mythology is not only its arsenal, but also its basis. Marx asks, is the conception of nature and of social relations which underlies Greek imagination and therefore Greek artistic expression possible in the age of self-vectors? Self-vectors, railways, locomotives, and electric telegraphs. What is Vulcan compared with Robertson Company? Jupiter compared with the lightning conductor, and Hermes compared with the credit mobilier. The basis of all mythology, Marx notes, is the suggestion in the imagination of the subjection and domination of the forces of nature. This basis disappears when real domination is achieved. Now, what becomes of Fama besides printing out square? Regarded from another angle, is Achilles possible when powder and shot have been invented? And is the Iliad possible at all when the printing press and even printing machines exist? Now, Marx's point here is not that the fluorescence of Greek art belies the material conditions of its production. His question is as to why we attach so much importance to it in the present day. Marx's answer is that it gives us pleasure in the same way that the naivete of children does. Quote, an adult cannot become a child again, or he becomes childish. But does not the naivete of the child gives him pleasure, and he must he not himself endeavor to reproduce the child's veracity on a higher level? Does not the specific character of each epoch come to life again in its natural veracity in the child's nature? Why should not the historical childhood of humanity, when it attained its most beautiful form, exert an eternal charm as a stage that will never recur? And I think you can see the preference for certain types of historical sculpture as being a certain weird problem for conservatives. But anyway, the introduction breaks off at this point. It's evidently unfinished, although how unfinished it is unclear. The only clue to what Marx would have written is his set of headings and subheadings, which is what is the important point for people like Heinrich or Oakley on what is all of Capital supposed to look like as a book. Production, consumption, distribution, exchange, that is circulation. That is one, production, general relation, production, distribution, exchange, consumption. C, lastly, exchanging and circulation. The method of political economy. Number 4, production, means of production, and relations of production, and conditions of communication. Forms of the state of consciousness in relation to the relations of production and commerce, legal relations, family relations, and that's it. Yes, I got to the end. Yes, I'm sorry it took so long and we had a delay. We don't have to look at it tomorrow, or I may find another example of this to sort of fiddle with. Because in general, I think what's nice about this, Ed George's notes on the introduction on chapter 3, is that it kind of identifies all of the key elements, including the Hegelian issue. Why does Marx, as a dialectical materialist, flip Hegel on its head? What is the kind of model for the question of form? And all of those things are there. It's all there. It's quite a useful little foundation, and does appreciate, in terms of when it was written relative to Marx's later work, kind of where his brain was at. So anyway, I'm done. I know that there are people waiting and for the next version of our little playtime here. I'm going to stop the live stream and then stop the share.